Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome. This is the first official event of our 150th anniversary weekend. I'm really happy to have you all with us today for what promises to be, I think, an engaging, thought-provoking discussion about higher education in the world today. Very fortunate to have with me our Provost and Dean of the College, Cindy Speaker, as well as our very special guest, Claudio Sanchez. Go ahead, I know you're going to. As you well know, Claudio is an educational correspondent with National Public Radio, and I'm so glad you were able to make the trip to Aurora to be here today along with your wife and daughter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In his role at NPR, Claudio focuses on the 3 Ps of education: politics, policy, and pedagogy. His recent stories for NPR have included the challenges of reporting on mass shootings in schools, how some colleges that have scrapped SAT and ACT requirements have increased their level of diversity, and a look at how teachers and students from Puerto Rico started over in the U.S. after last year's Hurricane Maria. Claudio joined NPR in 1989 after serving for a year as producer for the Latin American News Service, a daily national radio service based in El Paso. Before that, from 1984 to 1988, he was the News and Public Affairs Director at KXCR-FM in El Paso. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll also have time for questions from the audience afterwards, and I'm going to let Provost Speaker ask the first question.
Thank you. So we're going to start with some general topics in higher education, beginning with issues of enrollment and admission. And really, this has to do with test-optional colleges. So you may have heard that Wells College recently went test-optional, meaning that applicants may still submit their SAT or ACT scores if they wish, but they're not required to. Earlier this year, you covered a story by 3 researchers, Stephen Syverson, Valerie Franks, and William Hiss, which found that test-optional enroll and graduate a higher proportion of lower income and first-generation students and more students from diverse backgrounds. To those who do not follow the topic closely, that may seem somewhat counterintuitive. So can you give us some context on why this might be the case, and do you agree with the study's findings?
It's not up to me to agree or disagree with the findings, I don't think. It's really a matter of putting the evidence out there and having people decide for themselves. It's not that I'm skirting the question, but I think that to understand the importance of this study and what it says, you have to understand its history, how we in this country deal with admissions, why we select the people, why you select the people you do, and why you don't accept others. It's a very simple premise. In my book, the admissions process itself is flawed. We are now dealing with a system, 2 systems in America. One that is based on ability to pay, and the other one is based on, if you're lucky, how much money you can get from the government or from somebody else to go to college. It's a dual system, and it's, I think, a betrayal of what was once viewed as an aspirational goal in this country, which was to give everybody who worked hard the opportunity to go to college. So how does the SAT figure into this? And for the record, William Hiss, one of the people in the study, is the former dean of admissions at Bates College, where our daughter, Bianca, went to school. And by the way, thank you for being here, and thank my wife, Maria Teresa, for being here. I met Bill Hiss way, way back when I was doing the first salvo on this story of making the SAT an alternative, or at least voluntary, and that institutions would not have to use it as a sorting mechanism. Because, we all know, they may not admit it, state schools, public schools in particular, that are too big to do the more careful evaluation of students on an individual basis, they sort kids. They have cutoff scores. They use the SAT instrument, flawed and all, as an instrument for creating an incoming class that may or may not represent, may or may not be fair, may or may not represent the best of the people who they could have chosen. So when Bill Hiss came along and became one of the now, 1,400 institutions, including so-called more selective schools, the more recent case of George Washington University in Washington, a story I did there about them going, about that school going without the SAT. But Bill Hiss was in on the bottom floor of this issue, and I went to Bates College and did a story about how what is the other option to SATs? If SATs are no more a predictor than, or are basically not a predictor of academic success the first year, what does it do? What does it say? It's a sorting mechanism. I know that people in the College Board would disagree. We do predict, but we have to add GPA. We have to add, the rigor of the curriculum in high school. We have to add a bunch of things, but they insist SAT scores can't predict. I would argue that the evidence doesn't point to that. You know what and I was telling this to earlier to a class, the single biggest predictor of academic success in college is a mother's education. The level of a mother's education. That is the single proven predictor of academic success. The SAT has become, in my view, also a straw man. Either you hate it or you love it. People who continue to use it don't want to admit that it's used as a sorting mechanism. People who left it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth about why you left it, but they have left it because they've realized that it's become an obstacle to recruiting the kind of diversity that you all say you want. Now, why is this SATs? Why are SATs an obstacle to recruiting a more diverse population of students, whether it's by income, race, ethnicity? It's because the SAT doesn't reward kids who are growing up, or at least doesn't reflect the ability, the true ability of kids, the potential of kids who are growing up in disadvantaged homes, in underserved, underprivileged school systems. If high school or middle school or elementary school mean anything, it is what kind of school in terms of quality, what kind of teachers they have, what kind of curriculum do they have, what kind of resources do they have to lift all boats? Well, in this country, our schools are undernourished and undernourished in a real sense, disadvantaged because of this archaic funding system. I don't want to get off the subject too much here, but we have a system that is fatally flawed, that doesn't do nearly enough to create conditions, motivation for young poor people to do well in school. And by the time they're ready to graduate, even if they aspire to go to college, there are way too many barriers and closed doors in front of them. And one of those, I think, is the SAT. The SAT does not measure potential. If we had an instrument with which to measure potential, we'd all be much better off for it.
So, Claudio, I'm not going to let you off that easily when you say you don't want to get off track, right? The ability of many students from underprivileged backgrounds to obtain a high-quality private college education has become more and more out of reach. And you know that Wells College recently lowered our tuition by 25% starting next fall. We're doing our best to make the Wells experience available to as many students and families as possible. What have you seen other colleges and universities do, or perhaps not do, to help with this problem of accessibility? And more so, do you think that the state of higher education and its cost is causing a class war between the haves and the have-nots?
I think we run that risk. I'm not sure it's happened. I think a lot of other pieces would have to fall into place, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I think, you know, we were having this conversation over lunch, right, Christopher, about how you folks in the marketing department, your task is to, in the good sense, sell your university, sell your reputation, sell the good work you do here, market it, advertise it, get the word out. One of the inherent problems of lowering, I think, of lowering your tuition for it to reflect not so much the sticker price, but the real price, is that most Americans are attached to this notion that the more expensive a school is, the more prestigious it is. You know, people who have the means, they want to send their kids to places that, you know, charge you $60,000 a year. Because, boy, that school must be so good. It's got to be. Why else would I be paying $60,000? The minute you lower, for all the good reasons, you lower that tuition and say to people, this is actually what we're charging you. And, I mean, it's not cheap, but, boy, it's a lot less than those people charging $60,000. You run the risk of sending a message that people will take, which is, wait, that must mean you're lowering your standards. You're watering down your curriculum. You're firing your best teachers because your system is, you know, it's unsustainable by lowering your tuition. You're going to take in, you know, your school is going to be, bottom line, your school is going to be more or less selective because you're now making it cheap or cheaper. I mean, talk about a strange argument, you know, for people who want to see you keep your prices up. Because why? Because that reflects better quality? Not true. That's a myth. But talk to Mr. or Mrs. Consumer out there in the real world, and they've been conditioned. You know, they see what Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all Stanford are charging, and they go, yeah, those are great schools. Well, yeah, they're great schools, but does the amount of money that you pay to have your child go there, are they being accountable for that? You know, I've argued that the economic model of higher education generally that we've relied on, that you've relied on, is unsustainable. And I'm not the only one or the first one to say that. And I jotted down some notes. Back in, I think it was 2015, Moody's Investor Services predicted that the number of nonprofit colleges, private nonprofit colleges that would close down would triple. That's pretty much come to pass. The number of mergers would double. That's come to pass. I think we're at a time when the economics of higher education are incredibly complicated and they don't look good. The economics do not look good for institutions like this. For all the good work you've done, for as long as you've done it, 150 years, what you're doing here is, I'm not an economist, but it's unsustainable. How long can you go doing what you're doing, you know, and being healthy? And being healthy in terms of the economic model you have here. And I don't care how much you tweak it. That's a question for you and your board members, you and your supporters, your alum, to really answer. Because I don't see any answers out there. You know, just one more point, every fall there's a tendency among education journalists or people who cover higher ed to look for and feature colleges or programs that have done something really extraordinary to bring costs down, and also to enroll more racially diverse students. And the one that comes to mind always, I've never been there, is Berea College in Kentucky. And its promotion, talk about good marketing, right? Its promotional literature says, we're a little college with a $1.2 billion endowment where tuition is free and every student secures a job. Hey, that sells.
So speaking about small colleges, as well as this, celebrating its 150th anniversary this year, we face the same type of challenges that many other colleges do. Shifting demographics of high school students, rising costs of doing business, and high fixed costs, and of course, increasing levels of student debt. In your opinion, what should liberal arts colleges, especially smaller ones like ours, be doing or not doing to ensure their continued long-term success? What do you see as the biggest threat to higher education in general, or the biggest missed opportunity that the industry isn't taking advantage of?
I knew that question was going to come up, and I'm glad I took down some notes, not just from my own reporting, but what we're seeing. Here's the big picture answer. And here are the essential questions for higher education, including schools like this. Is the value of a college degree worth the price? And the buzzwords: corporatization, privatization, competition, innovation versus the status quo. What is the status quo? I remember one of these think tanks in DC, when I raised that question, he said, I'm going to answer that with a joke, and maybe you've all heard it. How many college presidents does it take to change a light bulb? Change? What's that? Who said anything about change? That's funny, but that's the answer. That's where we are. And so who are the change agents if they're out there? Well, the for-profits. Did you know that the enrollment of for-profits is up 236%? Technology will change everything. MOOCs, online, teaching. I was showing you, Dr. Gibraltar, the article, if you all have a chance, on the journal Education Next, I think it's this month, has a terrific article on what's changing in higher education. Well, it's all about online. And I've done my share of stories about online. Of course, what is it, Coursera? Is it Coursera? Yeah, Coursera. Right, out of Stanford. Talk to people in the Silicon Valley who see this and saw this as the trend, of course, to watch, especially in higher education. I've even done stories about a little outfit called the University of the People. No, and it's not some left-wing thing out of Berkeley or anything like that. It's actually the project of an Israeli entrepreneur who has since settled in Pasadena, California, and created an exclusively online university program that offers degrees in business administration and computer sciences. And yeah, they've paired, by the way, with NYU, New York University, very credible organizations. But you know what? They charge $50 max a year for you to enroll in these courses. And who are the people enrolling? Well, there's like the woman I interviewed on the fringes of the Amazon River between Peru and Brazil, who was quadriplegic, who couldn't go to school physically, and who was doing her master's in business administration online because of this program. She had a proxy who would be there to deal with the exams, things like that. Or there was the Palestinian student in Jordan as a refugee who was a warehouse supervisor who was taking these courses online as a computer engineer, an older man, who otherwise would not have had an opportunity. So you don't have to sell me on this, the wisdom of investing in online. I don't know if this institution has any courses online or not. But clearly, technology, it's got to be a change agent. I mean, to say it's not is kind of ridiculous. And last but not least, in terms of change, you've got the whole landscape that we now are seeing in the differing views of how race and ethnicity come into play or are part of a campus dynamic. And in that argument or in that debate, there are the arguments for and against opening up admissions to admit more diverse students. Then there's the argument about, well, by doing that, because there's an assumption that all those kids of color are going to come in less prepared, oh, are we watering down our curriculum? Another myth. And how are we going to make these students welcome once they're here? Because as I was saying earlier in the upstairs, you know, admitting these students is half the story. The other story is, how do you support them? How do you make them feel welcome? How do you make them feel that they're part of the conversation about how this institution evolves? Are you listening to them? You talk about change agents, as I was trying to tell students earlier. You are the change agents in higher education. I may have talked about politics and, you know, policies and buzzwords and technology and MOOCs and whatever, but students will change higher education through their activism, through their good example, through modeling, through going back to their communities that are underserved, not just as teachers or as business people or as inventors. You have to go back and model what a young, hardworking person can attain. For those who have no models whatsoever. That's change. And it's beyond the university. It's beyond, it's part and fabric of the social fabric of this country. And you know, people talk about hope in many communities that I visit. People talk about hope. But hope doesn't mean much. It's a word. But I see the embodiment of hope in higher education. What is the story of higher education in America, if not the story about hope? It's a rhetorical question, but I think you need to see higher education and how it's working or not working through the prism of this notion, this very important notion of hope, and what hope represents to different groups in this country, especially those who have, for whom hope seems less attainable.
Such a good point, and you speak about hope, and I wanted to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, which still hangs in the balance, and you've provided some coverage where you focused in part on its effect on over 8,000 teachers who potentially face deportation.
Yeah.
A year later, the DACA program's fate continues to hang in the balance. Multiple lawsuits are dragging on in federal court. Have you kept in touch with any of these teachers you interviewed for your stories, and what are their feelings now, and were any of them deported, and how has DACA, how has the situation affected education in border states like Texas and California?
It's a very tough story for me to tell sometimes. It's a kind of story that often reminds me, there but for the grace of God go I. Because I could have easily been a DACA student in my day. We have revisited, because clearly it's a story that kind of demands that we update every time, especially if we've told stories like the young woman at the University of Pennsylvania, Donald Trump's alma mater, who organized students there. She was from San Antonio, Mexican-American, who organized students there and forced the university to create a safe space for if and when the day came that immigration officials would swoop down on the campus and begin arresting or, detaining students who could not prove their citizenship. And sure enough, yeah, there's a part of campus where they can, they get an alert of some sort and they can go there and not, ICE agents can't go there. I don't know how they got this done, but they did it. So this young woman's story, when we updated it, she actually began, we had initially done a story with her about how the legal arguments, and University of Pennsylvania had sponsored a legal kind of workshop. They had attorneys arguing both the legality as well the illegality of whether campuses had the right to ban law enforcement from their campuses, whether or not they had to abide by federal laws that say that no, they can come in and pretty much raid the place. So anyway, but in doing that story, we met this young woman, and I ended up going back and asking her to tell us more of her story. When I went back to do an interview with her, she was not doing all that well. She was still really worried her final year because she had just heard back from her father that came this close to being deported back in San Antonio. Turns out he was driving around, and guess what? Broken taillight. And he gets stopped, and he doesn't have a driver's license, he doesn't have an ID. So the cop that pulls him over, this is according to the story we heard, pulls him over and says, you're undocumented. And you realize I could take you in and turn you over to immigration. And the dad said, yeah. And then the cop goes on to say, didn't you know that you could be caught? Didn't you know that you were running the risk of being, why are you driving around without a driver's license? And she told me, this young woman told me that her father, his only answer was survival. And the cop let him go. So we hear stories like that, and it may or may not inform the people out there who are trying to make the political arguments for or against DACA. But it's an important story to hear. Because people, I think, come away from the DACA coverage on one side or the other. It's black and white. It's yes, no, it's they're a threat, no, they're not. They're the only ones picking our crops, no, they're not. They're taking up all kinds of taxes, your money's being wasted. We're never going to end that debate. You need, in my view, you need to humanize this story. You need to humanize it, because for every story like that, there's also a story, and the one I'm thinking about is the family in Georgia, and the story was that this young woman, third-generation Ecuadorian immigrant, I mean, the kid had grown up as an American, as a U.S. citizen, second generation, I guess. Her parents were Ecuadorian. They had come in the legal way. They had paid their dues. They had immigrated, done well. So this young woman, who's still in high school, goes to a McDonald's, looks for a job, gets a job. Next to her is a young man, a little older, working in the kitchen. He gets promoted to assistant manager, a job that young woman felt she deserved because she was an American. And she said, he's illegal. Why am I not getting that job? And she went back home, and her mother, I don't know if she tried to sue McDonald's or she raised a ruckus. And she went on a local radio show, and she went off on, all these illegals. We're talking about an immigrant parent who was screaming at the top of her lungs, these illegals are taking opportunity and jobs away from us. And my daughter's case is a perfect example. And I asked myself, does she have a point? Some of the people who are most adamant about undocumented immigration, certainly the DACA phenomena, the DACA students out there who are affected, the attitude is, I paid my dues, I got in legally, you do too, go back. I'm not talking about, you know, white nationalists saying this. I'm talking about immigrants themselves who feel they've been affected by this. See, I think there's legitimacy in many of these arguments. The question is, are we providing a space where these can be heard without us trying to kill each other? Where we are not screaming at each other and past each other. Because I think that we're not going to come to any real consensus until we stop doing that. DACA has a solution. It's in the hands of Congress. But why do you think Congress has been unwilling and unable to change anything? Because we're all screaming at each other, and they hear the screaming, so they respond accordingly. You know, they hear the screaming, and it buys them time to do nothing. DACA right now, interestingly, I think is in the courts, despite what the Trump administration has wanted to do, or the Attorney General. But it's in the courts because it's in the one place where the law and our Constitution, interestingly, has protected them from this wholesale effort, political effort, to expel them. And so, who knows? I don't know where that's going to end. You know, these court decisions that have suspended the deportation of these students, and whether or not they're going to create the legal framework for Congress to then, you know, create the kind of amnesty that the program requires, that's what it is. I don't know where that's going. I don't think anybody does. In the meantime, these people are kind of living on borrowed time.
Switching gears a little bit, as a developmental psychologist, I was really interested in the story that ran the gap between science and reading to kids, where in February you covered a study by Mark Seidenberg, who wrote that the way children are taught to read is disconnected by the recent research that we have found that children need to understand the way the words and speech are interconnected. As a college that prepares elementary and secondary school educators, what can we and other colleges do to ensure basic literacy, scientific literacy among our graduates who go on to become teachers?
Yeah, I think that was that article that got a lot of response. You all remember the reading wars? The reading wars did more damage to how we teach reading than any other thing I can think of. The reading wars polarized the science. And this gentleman is a scientist. He knows the brain, he knows the way the brain works. He understands pedagogy. He understands how children function, how their brains develop, which in my view gives him enormous credibility. Now, the reading wars was a very simplistic attempt to describe how kids learned, and was off base in many ways. One side said, well, rich literature, wonderful books are the ways to teach, expose kids to those, is a way to encourage them to read, to learn almost, this was the extreme view, to learn almost by osmosis, you know, language and structure and so forth. Then there was the other extreme that said, no, it all boils down to phonics, symbols, and that each symbol has a sound, and that each sound has a place in a word, and that each word has a place in a sentence. So that phonics versus whole language, you could never get either one to give in anything. And I remember being at University of, or at Teachers College at Columbia, where there was this full-out debate and war of the, you know, whole language versus phonics folks. To me, I came away feeling like, we're not going to solve this anytime soon, maybe not even in my lifetime. Well, fast forward to today, and I actually think that the science and people, which is why this interview was so attractive to me, I thought, okay, so here's one guy who understands both sides and who has the evidence and the data, in part because the science has allowed us to really, really improve the way we understand the way the brain works. I mean, if you took me back 20, 25 years when the reading wars were at their worst, well, you know, you could argue, well, we didn't have the science to validate one view or the other. Well, guess what? And I could have told people that 30 years ago. There's a common ground. You need both phonics, and you need both phonics and rich literature. I would like to believe that in your college of education here, your school of education, that, because that was the other missing link. It's incredible. I remember thinking, it's incredible how many colleges of education where a student can get a 4-year degree and never learn how to never learn how to teach reading. You know, I could never understand that. And I would venture to say that lots of colleges of education to this date never teach their teachers how to teach reading. I don't know why. For the record, yeah.
I'm going to once again change the pace a little bit. We live in a kind of an insane time. And President Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, has put forth a number of controversial initiatives, including proposals to protect debt collectors regarding student loans, reducing government oversight of for-profit colleges, and walking back Obama-era regulations about how schools should handle sexual assault, not to mention her generally low opinion of traditional public schooling, which she's called a dead end, and those who defend the current system she roasts as flat earthers. What do you think will ultimately be her greatest legacy?
Talk about a leading question. Well, first of all, I should mention that, you know, my editor has been asking me for years to, at the end of the year, make predictions about trends in K through 12, higher ed. And this last year, I guess almost a year now, one of my predictions was that Betsy DeVos was going to resign. I'm still hanging on to that to that prediction, and don't read too much into it. I'm not saying it because I hate the woman, but because of the dynamics of what the Trump administration has brought to the Department of Education, which is the less we hear about you, the better. You know, people tell me, and it's true, Secretary DeVos is one of the most inaccessible public figures in political life in Washington. And I often remind people that Lauro Cavazos was no different. I don't know if you know, Lauro Cavazos was the dean. He was a dean, I think, at Tufts University. And he was a political appointee by the Bush administration back in the late 80s, and was a political choice because they needed a Hispanic to generate this Hispanic vote. The man was totally out of his element. He had handlers that, I mean, were crazy, took him to places where he didn't belong. I mean, literally. He was booed out of a conference in San Antonio for saying that Latino parents were to blame for their kids' poor education. Okay, now the man had no political savvy. And he was handled, and his definition of how education in this country was doing was showing SAT scores, state by state. So here's a guy who, because of just his inability to deal with policy, was essentially, you know, was not allowed to go out and talk to reporters. He was inaccessible. For different reasons, Betsy DeVos has been, NPR has put in, I've lost count of how many times we put in requests for interviews. She will interview only if she feels that you will not raise all the questions about her tenure or the Trump administration. And my prediction about her leaving the post was still, and it, to some degree, still based on this, you know, there's going to be an explosion, a bomb going off as soon as we hear more from the Mueller investigation. And I think that you're going to have cabinet-level officials flee. I really do see that happening by the end of the year. Betsy DeVos was chosen as Secretary of Education, and if any of you saw her confirmation hearings and the fact that Vice President Pence took his vote to break the deadlock in confirming her, you realize that in her confirmation hearings, she didn't know policy. She had a speech to give about the value of choice. You know, in some of these earlier classes that I've spoken to, we've gotten into the whole dynamics of school choice and all that stuff. But the bottom line is that her support for school choice became really the rubber stamp for her confirmation, at least in the eye of choice supporters. And they're not all Republicans, by the way. There are Democrats on that committee that have a record of saying, yeah, I support charter schools and school choice. So it was ideological, but it wasn't. Her record, though, if you were to look at her record in Michigan and Detroit in particular, your mouth would drop, because it is such a questionable record about how her support for choice actually helped poor communities, poor parents, poor kids. The evidence is really skimpy. You go to Detroit today, and because of choice and the way it's been done there, you come away feeling like, what was the point of that? Versus greater investment in good public schools. We all know they're flawed, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and improve them. The politics of DeVos and Trump in terms of education is interesting in that it's a good thing that Trump hasn't taken a real interest in education. No, seriously. Seriously, otherwise we'd be debating. I mean, you'd have talking heads on CNN or Fox. You'd be having some of the most ridiculous arguments, because some of those people who get on the air, as far as I'm concerned, are not informing, are not really helping educate or inform the American public. They're just screaming at each other. So in a way, it's a good thing, you know. Now, for me, it doesn't help, because I would love for education to be on people's radar. Really, for it to be, as Nation at Risk back in the mid-'80s said, if a foreign power did to our schools what we're doing to our schools, we'd see it as an act of war. I mean, that's pretty serious. What Nation at Risk did that has influenced the politics of this in Washington is that it raised the issue of education, public education, to the comparable to the issue of national security, which I believe it still is. It's a national security issue. It's not debated that way, it's not discussed that way, but that's what it is. It's educating the next generation of leaders, taxpayers, or people who depend on taxpayers. I mean, I don't understand why people don't get that, and why education, depending on the administration or how states are doing, falls off the radar on and off. You know, what was his, Romer, last name Romer, former governor of Colorado, who went on to become the chair of the national, Democratic National Chair, and who also served 6 years as superintendent of public schools in Los Angeles. Tough place. I once asked him, what's the toughest job you've ever had? I thought he was going to say, well, you know, the politics, being governor, dealing with, you know, political races. No, he said, superintendent of Los Angeles. something he did that was interesting after he served and retired from that post, he went around, he took up some think tank job, and he went around the country asking people how they were going to vote and whether education was one reason to pull a lever for someone or some other person. And because at the time there were all these polls that said education is the #1 issue that Americans, that are going to prompt Americans to vote a certain way. Education, #1. More than the economy, more than immigration, more than foreign policy, more than, you know, all these other big issues. Well, he didn't believe it. He just didn't believe it. And he went out and he interviewed people over kitchen tables, and he came back and wrote a really interesting piece talking about how this was such a huge myth that anyone would go into a voting booth and vote for someone because of their education record. Total fabrication. I don't know who created it, why it became an issue, but very distorted. But you know what he found? He found that people were upset about education, but in the abstract, the country is really bad, its education system compared to Japan and China and Germany and Europe. Oh, our 15-year-olds, boy, these kids, they're awful. They don't know math, they don't know how to talk, they don't know how to write. I mean, you'd have people just say, but so what about your 15-year-old and your school? No, they're great. Yeah, my 15-year-old, top notch, he's gonna go on to Harvard. Or our school district, oh, wonderful, great teachers. You know, it's not unlike the argument that people have made about all these stupid Congress people, lawmakers, but except mine, who is pretty good. I mean, it's people who are kind of hiding their heads in the sand, because all the data coming out of public education these days is pretty clear. We are losing the brain race. We are losing it. You know, there's a reason why H-2 visas are so popular. They help you bring in young Indian engineers, computer engineers. They let you bring in, you know, college graduates from all over the world to do the work that companies in this country are starving for, or at least I mean, the shortages are amazing. So, you know, I think that, I forgot the question now.
Betsy DeVos.
Yeah, Betsy DeVos. Yeah, well, that's how removed she is from the argument.
That I was actually going to ask you, you know, how people react during press conferences when she says insane things like, you know, we should be using federal dollars to arm school personnel, and that, you know, that they should have guns in schools to protect students from grizzly bears. I mean, she says
That was
things,
in her congressional testimony.
yeah, I mean, she says things that are so incomprehensibly insane that maybe it's just not even worth asking the
Well,
question.
no, and remember she said she didn't understand that IDEA, the law that kind of regulates, you know, how we treat kids with disabilities and the rights that they have, she didn't understand that that was a federal program.
Right.
She said, oh, no, you know, how you deal with them, it depends on the state. Yeah, that's a state issue. What? I mean, that level of ignorance, I think, I don't know. But you know, you have read recently that in this rush to undo everything that Obama did in terms of federal education policy, she has stumbled upon some real obstacles. I mean, you remember she said that, well, we're not sure that we're going to be able to reimburse all those kids who were cheated by, you know, these schools, schools that have cheated them out of all kinds of money and not giving them an education, these proprietary schools. Yeah. And remember, I mean, these kids are on the hook for tons of money, and the federal government, which should have known better in trying to police these or oversee the, the quality of education that we're getting, was going to pull out, and they were going to make them responsible for the money. Even though the companies or the corporations, whoever running these schools, were clearly getting off scot-free. I mean, nobody was going to jail. Nobody. To me, it was not unlike the Wall Street fiasco of some of the people who cheated this country out of treasure and trust, and who never paid, saw little or no consequences. It's exactly the same, except in a microcosm of what's happened. So anyway, so the recent story is that they've now had a change of heart, and they're now going to, the Department of Ed is either going to rethink or just abandon the idea of not helping these students who need to be reimbursed or who need to be left off the hook so that their credit records aren't screwed for the rest of their lives. But, some of the outrageous things, or things that we call outrageous that, these people, Mrs. DeVos or the president, do or say, it's all very simple to me. They're not crazy. And I think more often than not, they know exactly what they're saying. They're preaching to the choir, to their choir. They're representing the people who they feel that elected them to office. Although Mrs. DeVos wasn't elected, but she was chosen by people who were elected. Right. And I think that self-righteousness, that sense that I don't need to represent all Americans or all arguments. I'm here because of that group or this group. That's very much alive in Washington these days. That's what's at work. People who say we're a democracy, we're a representative democracy, but only for them.
I met with one of the women who was a student at Virginia Tech and was shot in her classroom.
And she survived?
And she survived, thankfully. And obviously forever changed her life in so many ways, and now she travels around the country to talk about that experience. And since the shooting at Virginia Tech, there have certainly been many other high-profile, very tragic instances at high schools and colleges across the country. What do you make of all of this? You've covered gun violence in education for quite some time.
Yeah. Well, I did, a reflection, what I call a reflection piece about what I've learned about school shootings, and went over beginning with before Columbine, a year before, there had been this incredible thing. There were 6 elementary school, well, no, it included high schools, 6 school shootings across the country. Paducah, Kentucky, Pearl, Mississippi, a place in Oregon, a place in Georgia, all very similar in that you had these kids who had been bullied. You had kids who had this horrible home life, who were suicidal. You had a range of reasons why some of these kids armed themselves and decided to kill their peers. But what I focused on was, what did we learn from each of these shootings? And then came Columbine. And in reflecting on all that, I thought, what have we learned? Why are we still debating what to do? And I remember the roller coaster, the policymakers, the lawmakers who, forget taking on the NRA and all that. That wasn't even the issue. The issue was, what are we doing to our young people? What are the red flags that are going on? What are the telltale signs that a child is so troubled that he or she, although mostly he, is going to kill? And I remember the Clinton administration talking about, pop culture and violent video games. They even had a summit back then at the White House. They had Hollywood come in and talk about violent movies. Yeah, right. Give me a break. I mean, you expect Hollywood to stop making violent movies? And so there was all this, what I view as bogus efforts, lip service, and concluding, based on what happened in Florida and the latest shooting there, that for all the well-intentioned efforts, we're no closer today than we were pre-Columbine or after Columbine. Because, I hate to say it, but we're going to hear about another shooting. We are. And whether it's 40 kids, 20 kids, or one child, one is more than we would like to see die at the hands of a shooter, especially another student. I'll tell you just one other angle to this. One example of the reaction to this was, and like Betsy DeVos would say, let's arm more teachers. Let's arm, let's have more cops in our schools. And I remember, taking that, not way before she supported the idea, but because it's been in the minds of many people, again, well-intentioned people who say, why not? You have someone, like the NRA says, right? The only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, believe it or not, some people surprised me in saying, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I was in Olathe, Kansas, at a very affluent suburban school, doing a feature on the school resource officer, which is short or long for a cop at the school. Young guy, he looked like one of the students, and he had a really good rapport with the students. He was armed with a Glock. He had a rifle actually an M16 in his office. And he had a guy helping him who was a former sheriff's deputy, also armed, kind of as support. So he gives me a tour of the school. Again, one of these schools that, sends all its kids to good colleges, kind of like a typical suburban school in my view. And so we walk up to the second floor, and he says to me, this is where we have our school psychologist, and we have two of them, two school psychologists here, which to me was surprising because, those are very rare in high schools these days. And I was going to ask, well, so what do they do? And he just kind of matter of fact said, we have 60 suicide threats in our school, or suicide watch kids who are borderline suicidal, who we know of, who've come into this office with school psychologists and told us why they feel this way, that they want to die. Now, they don't say, I want to die, but before I do, I want to kill other kids. But these are kids who are suicidal. And all the data out there that the FBI, the national security agencies that have looked into this have said is a profile of a child who's ready to kill is a child who wants to be killed. Suicidal. So my jaw dropped. Wait a minute. 60 kids in this school that you know of are borderline suicidal. What kind of help are they getting? Very little. Do their parents know? Some do, some don't. Some who do don't want to believe it. So I just came away feeling that for all the guns that you want to bring onto a school, in fact, the principal at the school had a change of heart. He had said to me, the legislature in Kansas has been debating this, having more guns in the school business, and I would have said no a few years ago, but now, I'm not so sure. I think I would have a gun in my desk, and maybe I could stop someone from killing more kids. He had a change of heart. But to me, what it looks like is like there's very little you can do to stop a gun, an armed intruder or a student from doing what he is set up to do. But I think you can do a lot to deal with those 60 kids on suicide watch. I mean, there's a way, I think, to diffuse this issue, or at least try and get at it, by investing the kinds of resources we all know we need to get at kids' hearts and minds. Why do they do this? Why, people who've interviewed some of these kids involved in shootings have come away pretty much convinced that that somebody, an adult in a school, preferably somebody who knows what these kids are going through, will be able to intervene. Well, if you're telling me that having 3 more people with guns in a school is better than hiring at least 1 or maybe 2 school counselors and psychologists, you're wrong. But that's where we are.
Thank you. Claudio, I have one more question, and then I'd like to open it up to all of you if you have questions, and I hope you've been thinking about that. Thinking about education today, what gives you hope?
Kids, I went into reporting on education thinking I'm never going to be doing this more than maybe 3 to 5 years. It wasn't, I wanted to cover immigration, and because that's, having reported from the U.S.-Mexico border for so long, I thought, yeah, that's my beat. That's where I see myself. Another big, important issue, but I was offered the job reporting on education. But the more I covered education, the more I saw schools as a window to the future of this country, and allowed me to report on issues like immigration in a way that I had not expected, which meant covering immigrant families, children in this country who don't speak English, parents who don't speak English, and how they're dealt with in schools. So I had the best of both worlds, because I had both worlds. But what the beat has taught me is that I don't care how destitute some families are. I don't care how poor a community is. I could be in Appalachia, Kentucky. I could be in inner city, Houston. I could be in the most rural communities in this country that where schools often go without even the most basic things. You could take me anywhere in this country, and in every place, I will find hope. I will find a great teacher. I will find a great set of parents. I will find great kids, who, in rural America, I find that people don't take their education for granted the way, for lack of a better comparison, where often suburban families do. Those programs for gifted kids, even though they're shortchanged. Those AP programs, those honors courses, the great teacher who they were able to keep because they could pay them a little bit more. Sometimes we take those people for granted. And you don't miss them until you go to a place where you don't see them. And yet, kids and families in those communities survive and sometimes even thrive. Going back to the GW story about the SATs, the kid that the young man who I interviewed to make the point about how him not having to present his SATs got him into a very selective school. Well, his story was that his mother was Honduran, his father was Jewish from New York. He had a really interesting upbringing in I forget the name of the town, Las Lunas, New Mexico, I think, where there was only one high school, and where the turnover of teachers was like every year they'd have. He went 3 years without a math teacher because he couldn't find one. So here's a kid who had all kinds of disadvantages, who was really bright, gets into GW, and is thriving like you wouldn't believe. See, to me, that's a story of hope. Because here's a kid who knows what adversity is, who knows what it's like to not have, to go without, and that didn't keep him down. That didn't keep him from saying, I can get to GW. But guess what? GW opened its doors to me. You know, had he been able to do it, or would he have been able to do it before, you know, GW brought, you know, made that or remove it as a requirement? Probably not. He wouldn't have gotten in. So whenever I can match hope with policy, man, I jump on it. I say, this is an example of why we can't give up on the people who create the policies or the kids who are going to benefit from those policies.
Thank you. And I think every one of the educators in this room would agree that we get a lot of hope from our students. Now I'd like to open it up. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask, Chris is going to take this microphone and bring it around, and Mr. Sanchez, I'm sure, would be happy to take some questions. Just raise your hand.
Question over here, or I don't know.
Oh, sorry, right here.
Again, it's hard to see. There we go. Okay. Doing my Phil Donahue.
Yeah, right.
Hello. Wait. Hello. My name is Adonis. I worked in public school.
Could you tell us just a little bit more? Junior, sophomore, freshman?
I'm a first year.
First year?
Yeah.
Where
Anything
from?
else? Bronx.
Bronx.
Yeah.
Bronx, New York. Okay.
I worked in public schools. I worked in 3 different public schools in the city, and there were 3rd and 4th graders who couldn't read or couldn't do like basic division. So you say that students.
I'm sorry. Can everybody hear him? Okay, you're gonna have to speak up.
Can y'all hear me now? Okay, my bad. I worked in public schools where there's 3rd and 4th graders who couldn't read, some couldn't write very well, or could do basic division. And you said students bring the most change. So what can we do for them since they don't know that they're missing out on something? So what can we do as young adults to help them get a better education?
Become a teacher and teach them how to read and how to write. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny or facetious. I mean, I was telling another class earlier that, you know, what's the single biggest factor in quality of education in this country? It's teachers. Quality of teachers. People going into the profession, not for a year or two, but who can commit at least 5 years. I don't know very many teachers who have taught more than 5 years. Well, not many. I've known some teachers who've taught 30, 40 years. But you know what? Those teachers who've stayed in the classroom that long, especially dealing with the kinds of kids you're describing, there comes a point where it's not that their passion wears out, but their understanding of these kids wears out. I was in Toledo, Ohio, to do a story about how a school district was getting rid of incompetent teachers who just weren't doing the job. Well, almost all of the teachers that were up for review had been teaching 20 or more years. And I'm thinking, wait, that's kind of counterintuitive, because if you've been teaching that long, you should be a pretty good teacher. I mean, you've seen it all, you've experienced it, you know how to deal with that kid who comes in not reading. I mean, the fact that you've been teaching that long should be evidence that you're either pretty good or that you know what you're doing. Well, the reason, and I was allowed, this was all very confidential, I couldn't give names or anything, but the piece allowed me, and it was because the woman up for review allowed me to use her name, but I was able to sit in on her hearing. And this was a woman in her maybe late 40s, early 50s, who had been teaching 22 years, or even, about 22 years, and who told me the story of, why she was struggling so much. Well, she said there was this one day when she was teaching 8th graders, I think, when I went into my classroom and I left for a minute, and when I came back, I couldn't get in. And I said, what happened? Well, the kids had piled all the desks and chairs in front of the door. and they wouldn't let me in. And I thought, well, I'm sure these were just pranks. Or not. No, they said they didn't let me in because they hated me. And I said, well, so what's going on? And she said, they don't think I connect with them anymore. They don't think I'm helping them. These were not kids who were doing it so much as a prank, but kids who felt in their hearts, this lady isn't doing it for me. She's just not teaching me. She's not engaging me. And you know, when people often place the blame on unruly children, they're not unruly, they're bored to death. They're bored. You're not engaging them. And that's your job. I'm not saying entertain them. I say engage them, make them feel like they're invested in their own education. I would like to believe that a good teacher can keep that kind of passion going. But again, to answer your question, that's what those kids need. You know, they need a good teacher. One other anecdote that, again, more often than not, I come across is a teacher who was burned out, who may have been a great teacher. I was in Far Rockaway, New York, doing a story years ago about a middle school teacher. Middle schools, by the way, are my favorite, because that's where all the drama's going on. So we're there visiting, and we're in the lounge, and there's a teacher at the end of the table who's kind of dozing off. And we just, you know, went over and introduced ourselves. My producer, who had been, he had been a teacher or a substitute teacher, and he was really interested in going with me. He was not assigned to me. The show that wanted the piece wanted him to go with me, and all things considered. And so he sent him along. They sent him along with me. And he went over to nudge the teacher and say, you know, we're visiting, we're reporters, what can you tell us about the school? And so forth. And she kind of started mumbling something. And then we heard this really screeching, awful sound. And she just said, oh, that sound, that means that the principal has locked himself in his office. Oh yeah, why? Well, because there's probably a fight somewhere in the school. And kids are going crazy. Oh, okay. And then I said, so does this school have a lot of fights, problems? It was school of mostly very poor kids, mostly Hispanic, Latinos, and African American. And, and she said, this school is awful. You know why, she said? Because those children are animals. What? And my producer says, we got to tape this. We got to record this. And I kind of said, well, can we record this? Can we? She said, absolutely not. Of course not. I say, why not? I'd get fired for saying it. And, well, so why are you teaching here? My pension. You know, I've always remembered that story, even though it may be unfair that, well, it's clearly unfair for me to suggest that a majority or even lots of teachers feel that way, but it was a window to how some people feel and what often keeps, in reflecting in my own experience as a teacher, I came to the conclusion very quickly that I was going to do more damage than good as a teacher because I didn't know what I was doing. And yeah, I needed mentors. I loved doing what I thought was good, but I felt adrift. I couldn't, I just couldn't see myself doing. And I thought, man, you don't want to be in my classroom. I just don't know. I don't know how to help you. I would love for more teachers who come to that juncture in their lives, in their professional lives, to be able to say that seriously and say, I can't do this anymore because if I go back, I'm going to do more damage than good. I think that would be a very brave and the right thing to do.
Another question? Yes.
Hello, my name is Hannah Mancini. I'm first year. My mother has been a teacher longer than I've been alive, and she loved what she did. I remember when I was little and I would go to her class after school, and students asked like, "Oh, who are you?" And I told them whose daughter I was. Their eyes would light up. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, yay! It's I love your mom." And but my mom, she kept studying online and kept getting more degrees, and supposedly from what I've heard, she was, she tried to get someone who was higher up in the school. She shed some light on something they did that was not very ethical.
She was a whistleblower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because of that, and because she kept getting more degrees and they getting more raises, they found a bunch of small reasons like being 5 minutes late a bunch of times and things like that to fire her.
So I was about to ask, she's not teaching anymore.
Well, she doesn't teach high school anymore, but she does teach young children sometimes.
Yeah. So is she the reason you want to become a teacher?
I myself am not becoming a teacher, but I was just wondering what are things that we can do to protect teachers who are actually
Yeah.
good, but who might be facing some trouble because they...
Well, I don't know about the specifics of the case, but yeah, there are teachers who will challenge the status quo, who will see things that are done that are wrong. There are teachers who will look at a colleague and say, you could be doing things better, and maybe if, or here's how you should handle a problem. And some of those teachers often they're not welcome. They feel unwelcome because if they're good teachers and they have the experience and the practices that they want to share, unfortunately in this country, in public education, we've created an adversarial relationship among teachers. Teacher A will close the door and not let anybody in. Teacher B will be hungry for someone to come into her classroom or his classroom and help them. But we've become little silos in some of these schools. And over the last 30 years, I've been to enough schools to know that those silos are really damaging. I keep hearing teachers say, this is a profession that requires camaraderie and sharing of knowledge, collaboration. But boy, it's harder in practice. Because I've run into many schools where, with no prompting whatsoever, a teacher will approach me and say, don't go to so-and-so's classroom because he's an awful teacher. And they'll badmouth them, and and I don't know what the ulterior motive is, but often teachers find themselves as protective or defensive because they feel that someone is after their job, or that they're not going to get that next promotion. I don't know what you can do about that, though. I think we need to create another construct for how we train teachers. I was thinking about, you made me think about my daughter's experience in Japan. We visited, my wife and I visited her, went to the high schools where she was teaching English, and we had heard about how the schools, the collaborative environment, and the teachers now, it's not perfect, but in Japan, it's a collective investment. By that I mean that the teachers don't feel like they're being judged, their school is being judged and is being evaluated. I think that would go a long ways in feeling like, if you're a good teacher in a school with very few good teachers, but you're not going to be evaluated based on your individual performance, but rather on how the whole school is doing, well, guess what? Everybody's going to start working towards a better school. And those good teachers can become the mentors. And those good teachers can say, you're having trouble with discipline? Let me show you how you deal with it. Because the effort the enterprise then becomes a collective enterprise, and it becomes a way to showcase, how a school can improve rather than, oh, this year I was rated or ranked better than last year. That individual, that little silo that we call a teacher, is the one being judged, no matter what else or whoever else is being judged that way or not. It may sound simple. I realize it's not. It's not. It's complicated to make those kinds of changes. But, one small example is that under Clinton, when federal aid for schools went up a little, this was before No Child Left Behind and all that stuff. Well, there was an effort to say, here's how much money we can add or supplement a school if the school proves or shows they've improved school climate, dealing with the most challenging students, raising their test scores, a little bit of everything. But it was the idea that the school would benefit, not that the science teacher would somehow get a bonus of some sort. But you know what happened? Many school districts took that money and gave it to the science teacher or to the teacher who they felt, teacher of the year gets a bonus. Wrong-headed, even though the money could have been spent on rewarding a school for doing good.
Any other questions? In the back? Can't see too well. Do you have a microphone coming?
Way over here.
I hope you're all not too depressed by what I'm saying.
Hello, I'm Ted Lasowski. I've been teaching here at Wells for 29 years and teaching at a variety of other institutions 12 years prior.
Let's give this man an applause.
On my commute in this morning, I was listening to a couple of radio talk shows, and the topic was people who've decided to not take a leap towards classical education, but to go into various kinds of vocational trainings. One young man stated that he had a 4-year bachelor's degree, but upon graduating decided to go to a vocational school and became a lineman. And he said that over the past several years, that he's making significantly more money as a lineman than he would have working in a cubicle pursuing what he studied at school. Now, I'm very happy for the fact that he did have a 4-year education and can probably make better decisions with his life going forward. But a lot of people are taking vocational training purely because of economic reasons, and I was curious to know what your views are with regards to that.
I think that's the slippery slope that higher ed is in right now. I had taken down some notes on this because it is a really urgent issue, and I think it's an important issue to cover in the larger effort to capture what's the trends in higher education. And I wrote this down on my way here. The importance of the intellectual and social development of Americans has taken a back seat to technical training, so that what matters is skills development and how quickly and cheaply it can be accomplished in the name of economic growth. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in Iowa, companies like Winnebago, Target, Google are paying their employees college tuition. Okay, that's a trend. More and more companies that see their investment in these young people, or even experienced workers, as they're going to need a college degree at some point. But here's the rub. The training that they want these people to go through is vocational. Community colleges are a perfect example, and I wouldn't predict this, but I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years many small colleges becoming more like community colleges in terms of their focus, Community colleges, and this is the figure I have right now, train 80% of the nation's police officers, firemen, emergency medical personnel, more than half of all nurses and healthcare workers. And yet funding for these institutions is dropping. That's going to create, in my view, like two trains colliding. You have the economic imperative of business and CEOs and people like that saying, our colleges, 4- and 2-year colleges, have to begin to reflect the real needs of our economy. Let's stop beating about, what is the expression? Beating about the bush. We need workers. We don't need philosophers. We don't need poets. We may or may need musicians, but we need workers. We need workers to compete. We need workers because China is competing, because India is doing this or doing. Fine, that may all be true, but are we sacrificing the kind of education that makes a person well-rounded at the altar of economic prosperity, whatever you want to call that? I think there are people who've decided that yes, we need to. That's survival. That's Darwinian thinking. You know, I don't know if Wells College should train the next generation of police officers or nurses, but I think that what schools like this are doing is creating a generation, preserving a generation of people who think. I'm not suggesting, I can just see it now, NPR reporter says officers don't think. I'm not suggesting that these other professions that we consider vocational, on the contrary, these are some of the brightest people out there. You know, I've met plumbers who could run circles around any mathematician. I've met, you know, all kinds of folks in these fields that are as smart, if not smarter, than some of the folks in our elite institutions. What I'm saying is that this is an environment in which we have to preserve, because it creates an environment for people to come and be civil about their differences. And this is an environment in which people can think out loud, can examine themselves and their potential, and choose what America has promised, which is opportunity. I don't think we can just give that up. Now, you know, in community colleges where I have visited, where the people there are focused, and many of them are coming back, you know, after having, I did stories out of California where when the aerospace industry was going under, you know, men and women who had been computer engineers or had been mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, were back in a community college learning how to set up an alarm system for a business. Must not have been easy, but that was survival. And so what you've created, or what this economy has created, is an environment, a situation, conditions that have convinced people that if you don't survive with the skills you have, of what use is that degree in philosophy? That's the thinking that's going on. You know, when we were doing stories about Occupy Wall Street, and I was visiting places like Austin and Eugene, DC certainly, and other places, I was usually ending up on, you know, public parks where these people had set up shop and tents and things. Kept running into graduate students, you know, and I would ask them, so you have a degree, a master's or whatever, you have a degree in what? Oh, history, philosophy, and so why aren't you teaching, or why aren't you, you know, counseling? What's the matter? Well, there aren't enough jobs in those areas and they don't pay enough. So the whole point of you being or protesting Wall Street is what? Well, I'm not sure. It just gets me to do something. I mean, I couldn't understand that, really. You know, how a young person with a degree would kind of, you know, be in that position. maybe I'm missing something, but, you know, Occupy Wall Street for all the interesting things or good things it may have done in terms of triggering a good conversation about wealth in this country and the haves and the have-nots, it petered out to some degree, and the people who were, young people who were in it, by and large have come out of it somewhat even more jaded than they were before, because the movement didn't really accomplish much. I mean, Wall Street is back doing what it was doing, you know, before it collapsed. And the Congress has played a role in that. Tax policy, I mean, we're back to square one would argue. What did we learn about, well, if nothing else, we should have learned that people who get their college degree need a job. We need to employ those people. They're good kids, good people, hard workers. Because it's criminal, I think, to make them think, and I realize that it's, you know, it's something that they have to believe themselves. But we as a society cannot just say, your degree is worthless. You're worthless. Just because they studied the quote-unquote non or vocational or wrong degree. I think Americans too often disrespect what higher education is doing that's good. And they're more likely to be the critics and say, I'm paying too much for that school, and they have no evidence that what I'm paying for my kid's education is worth the paper it's on. There's that thinking.
Claudio, you probably have learned by now from your time at Wells that if I continue to open up this to questions from our audience, you probably would be answering them till midnight.
Yeah.
And maybe beyond. But we're so grateful for the time that you've spent with us today and that you'll continue to spend with us this evening and tomorrow morning, and what an honor it has been for us to have you here. And ladies and gentlemen, please, a round of applause for Claudio Sanchez.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to mention to all of you that tonight, this is not only the 150th anniversary of Wells College, it's also the 25th anniversary of the Wells Book Arts Center. And tonight, there's a reception for what's called WBAC Wells Book Arts Center at 25, an exhibit in main building's String Room Gallery that celebrates both the college's 150th anniversary as well as the Book Arts Center's 25th anniversary. The reception runs 6:30 to 8:30. The exhibit is a collection of works from 11 past and present Book Arts Center Victor Hammer Fellows. Also, if you would like to have the most recent updated 150th anniversary schedule, please check wells.edu/150. Thank you all again for being here this evening.